I picked her name out of a jar. That's what started everything. It sounds small, ridiculously small, soft as glitter on a mitten. A round paper slip folded twice, nothing heavier than a coin. But when you work seasons at a department store and the city is asking you to sign your name to a charity board, those little slips are how strangers become obligations. That Christmas, my store had a secret Santa program for the elderly. Draw a name, buy a gift, deliver it on Christmas Eve. I drew Mrs. Elellanar Chen, lives alone. I wrote it on the back of my hand and forgot about it between jacket racks and credit receipts until the last hour on the 24th. She lived 3 subway stops away, in a block of narrow row houses that smelled like coal and fried onions. The building had a glass transom above the door and a wind chime that always seemed to be stuck on one note. I rang at 9:30 because the city was in that late gold light where the stores already have their lights dimmed to cozy, and people pretend they aren't exhausted. She answered in a cardigan that might once have been fashionable, as if she had polished it for the visit. Her hands were cold. Her eyes were remarkably sharp for someone who had let silence set so comfortably around her. "Jennifer," she said immediately when I handed over the box. For a second, I thought I hadn't introduced myself. My store name tag flashed my real name in dull nettle, but she kept calling me Jennifer. She called me my girl, and come in, and set a chipped teacup between us. The apartment smelled like old paper and tea bags. There were photos in frames, scattered like driftwood across the mantel. A house with a white porch I recognized from my childhood, a family dog I had long forgotten, a little girl on a swing with my own face. I told myself it was coincidence, the way a city recycles the same faces over decades. I smiled and left before the hour grew heavy. The next morning, at 6:47 a.m., there was a package on my stoop. I knew the exact time because I woke to the sound of something hitting the building's communal landing, soft, like a shoe tapping, and my phone read 6:47 when I looked. The box was small, wrapped in cheap brown paper, tied with twine. No return address. Inside was a photograph of my childhood house, taken from the same angle as one of the pictures on Mrs. Chen's mantel. On the back of the photograph, in careful looping handwriting, was, "Remember, Jennifer." A week later, another package arrived at dawn, a dab of a discontinued perfume, the exact scent my mother favored when she taught me to tie my scarf. After that, a used bus pass with the number of the elementary school I had gone to. After that, a child's birthday card with the wrong name penciled out and mine written in its place. Someone could have been stalking me. Of course, that was the rational explanation. Someone had my address. Someone had been looking through online archives and thrift store photo collections. Someone had found a way to weave familiarity into my mornings. I called the police. They took my statement and asked the same questions every officer asks in that precise, practiced tone. Who would want to hurt you? Do you have enemies? Has anyone been inside your apartment? They checked the parcels for prints, they said. They told me to change my locks. They wrote a report and left me with a number I was ashamed to admit I never used. The packages didn't stop. They arrived like tiny, polite intrusions, a discontinued paperback I used to read under the duvet, a newspaper clipping of an event I had not attended but had watched my mother attend years ago. Each one was a precise wedge into my history. Surveillance footage from our building's lobby showed the boxes materializing at the foot of my stairs, no person visible on the camera, the landing empty. But when I saw the footage, the hair on my neck went cold in a way that had nothing to do with fear of an intruder. Objects placed themselves into the world with the ease of a hand I couldn't see. Then came the afternoon Mrs. Chen started calling. She would ring my phone at odd hours and breathe my name into the receiver. She would tell me about the weather, about a cake she had burned, about a time Jennifer fell and skinned her knee. Once she asked if I remembered the song my mother hummed while kneading dough. Another time she told me that Jennifer didn't have to travel far to come home. She said these things without maliciousness.
She sounded like someone rearranging memories until they fit. The night the police came to her apartment for a welfare check, I told myself I would stand by the door and not open anything I wasn't ready for. It was Christmas Eve. The city had learned to hold its breath. The neighbor who answered the officer's knock said Mrs. Chen hadn't been seen in days. Someone, an unnamed friend, had finally called the station with their concerns. When the officers made their way through the flat, they found the front rooms lined with photographs of me. That much the police reported later in the morning. Photos taken from the opposite side of my childhood yard, frames cut from journals, notations written along the bottom of the images. They said they found a calendar with dates circled in red, family birthdays, anniversaries, and the phrase "Jennifer comes home forever" written across December in a shaky hand. They forced the basement door. The police described a small room under the floorboards, a space plastered with photos and magazine clippings. There was a child's bed, small in scale, and a chair with threadbare upholstery facing a wall of faces. On the chair were knotted scarves, a type of homemade craft knitting that my mother had taught me once when I was 8 and impatient. The officers found a syringe, but the details of why it had been there or how it had been intended were left vague in the report.
The phrasing was careful, evidence of preparation, paraphernalia suggestive of plans to detain and sedate, objects arranged as if the room had been made to lure or to keep. When they took her to be evaluated, the official language, as they told me, was blunt and clinical. The evaluation showed she genuinely couldn't distinguish reality from delusion. She believed the apartment across the hall belonged to her daughter, Jennifer. She believed I had already been in her life. That is what they said. They said she was dangerous to herself and possibly others. They said they would hold her for observation. I moved. I kept my new apartment's address to myself. I changed my number and filled every contact form in my life with falsehoods that felt ugly in my mouth. It didn't matter. The packages continued. They shifted tone, becoming less like gifts and more like evidence. A cufflink that matched one shattered in a photograph of my father. A note with a doctor's office number circled and my childhood nicknames scribbled beside it. Sometimes there were recordings left on my voicemail, hours of someone humming the same lullaby my mother used to hum when she was anxious. When I called back, I heard only chesty breathing and the clack of porcelain. The police said the packages stopped briefly after Mrs. Chen was institutionalized, but that a handful of parcels arrived again, one sent even after the facility told the officers she could not be communicating with the outside world. They suggested gently that the parcels might have been sent before she was admitted and simply delayed. I wanted to believe them. I wanted to think the post office had secretly transformed into an accomplice, or that a family member, angry and jealous, had not known how to stop. But one winter morning, weeks after I'd convinced myself I could breathe again, there was a red scarf at my door, thick, home-knit, and still smelling faintly of mothballs and tea. A folded piece of paper tucked into one loop said, "I'll always find you, Jennifer." This was no anonymous act of cruelty that could be attributed to a random passerby. This was intimate. This was a hand knotted through a memory. I stopped celebrating Christmas. I sold the ornaments I had intended to unpack and gave away my wreath. I deleted photos, canceled cards, avoided every small inevitable ritual that invited strangers into my life. Carolers, charity boxes, even a secret Santa at work. For a while it felt like I had given away parts of myself along with the ornaments, traded tradition for a sense of physical safety. The police file closed with a note. Mrs. Chen was detained and sent for treatment. There was no evidence to press further charges. Preventative orders were discussed but not pursued. It read like accounting. It did not document the nights I slept with the lights on,
and the mornings I checked my stoop for a box.
When I say all of this aloud now, because someone asked me to tell what happened, and because silence had become another kind of pressure, people often ask, "Were you sure it was her?" They mean, could it have been someone else? Could it have been coincidence? That is reasonable. The rational argument is what I clung to for as long as I could. But there was the handwriting that matched scrapbooks from Mrs. Chen's apartment. There were the thrift store photo angles. There were the tea-stained cups and the smell of mothballs in the scarf. There was a calendar whose red circles matched dates that had been important to me long before I met her. And most of all, there was the way she said my name as if it had been missing from the world. That kind of insistence is not a coincidence. It is a map. I still think of her sometimes, not because I miss the intrusions, but because I miss what they replaced. The way the city felt smaller and kinder in the weeks before the packages began. The openness of the holiday season had been a hinge for us. The charity jars, the doorbells, the assumption that strangers are in need and that needing them earns our attention. That hinge is small and easy to force open. It is a kindness that can be exploited. It is the difference between being safe and being seen in the wrong way. They say you should put locks on your mailbox. They say you should be wary of strangers bearing gifts. They say a lot of things after something happens that change how you trust the world. None of those rules felt adequate when you wake to a package and the memory in it looks back at you. If you like true, quiet scares or want to hear more, subscribe. But not because I want the numbers, because there are more stories like this, and they are not always easy to stop listening to. Weeks after I left the neighborhood for good, an old coworker told me something over coffee. He'd been folding sweaters at the store in mid-January when a woman came in and asked for the charity jar. He said she looked like she carried the weather on her cardigan. He said when she spoke, she did not say her name, but asked, "Is there someone here who needs a little surprise?" He watched her draw a name and tuck it into her pocket. He watched her leave with a package under her arm. He thought nothing of it at the time. He thought it was what people did that season. Sometimes kindness is easy to mistake for something else. Sometimes you give a part of yourself without asking whether you can take it back. They find ways to come back. Things that are small and polite and seasonal become threads. You cut one and another forms. I didn't think I would ever tell another story after the scarf at my door. I thought I had given the year my silence, that I had traded in the noise of people for the slow, safe hum of not being recognized. That was until the night I house-sat for a friend and heard a choir where no choir should have been. The neighborhood where my friend lived was the sort of place that kept its Christmas lights up longer than necessary, as if gratitude could be stretched by hanging bulbs on a string. It was quiet in that particular way old neighborhoods are quiet. Cars tucked away, a low TV glow, the kind of silence that feels like a held breath. I was there for the weekend, tasked with feeding the cat, watering the poinsettia, keeping plants from despairing. My friend, a lawyer with an impossible calendar, left at dusk and joked about how rarely anything happened on her block. "Unless the neighbor's dog has an existential crisis," she said, but her voice softened in the way friends do when they leave you with keys. That night, at 9 p.m. precisely, I heard them. From the direction of the porch came singing, 3 voices harmonizing so perfectly they could have been made by one instrument. At first I thought it might be a small group of college carolers or a street performer who read the neighborhood like sheet music. I opened my door, planning to watch through the glass and maybe drop $1 into a hat. On the porch, 3 figures stood in Victorian coats and hats, their clothes anachronistic but immaculate, like costume shop rejects that had slipped back into time.
They sang with a clarity that made the air seem thin, but their eyes, if you could call them eyes, were blank, unblinking pools. They did not look at me. They seemed to sing past me, singing instead to a point just beyond the stoop. Their voices slid from jollity to something personal in the space of a single line. One of them, lower, male, taught the rhythm into a phrase that included the name of my aunt, the street she lived on, and a private detail about a luggage tag I had lost on a trip to Ithaca. I wound my fingers around the doorknob until the metal bent in my palm. I went to the security camera to check. The feed showed my porch. Empty, a swing of wind caught in the wreath, nothing but the soft snow gathering on the step. It did not show 3 people in Victorian dress. I walked back to the door, and there they were, still singing. The sight of them and the footage at once became a small proof against itself, a contradiction pressed into the space of 1 block. I filmed them on my phone, because that is what you do in a moment when something improbable happens and you want to be sure you're not the person in a story. My video captured a wavering shadow at best. Sound was muffled, and then, curiously, the audio cut out right as the song turned to a verse about someone's childhood secret. My file, when I listened back, had a hollow where their voices should have been. The visual, meanwhile, was terrible and literal, an empty porch where 3 people had just stood. The next night, at 9 p.m., I heard them again. This time, I put the camera in the window and left the lens pointed at the porch. I wanted evidence, and I wanted the comfort of proof.
They arrived on time, as precisely as a train, murmuring like someone remembering their lines. They sang lines about an old accident on a road I had never driven, and about a garden my neighbors had kept secret. The song turned toward me, slow and intimate, and the figure at the center, a woman with a voice like church bells, sang, "We have been waiting at your doorway for a long, long while." When I checked the footage, again it showed nothing, an empty porch, a wreath, a drying boot. The camera's timestamp read 9 p.m. in crisp red numerals. On the window glass, where the camera's lens reflected faintly, I caught a flash of 3 faces in the glare, too quick to identify, like something seen underwater. My phone, meanwhile, had an audio recording with a whisper of wind and then a single clear line. "We remember where they buried us." It is easy to tell yourself you're making a story when your life begins to pattern like this. You tell yourself you are a protagonist in a strange, interesting anecdote and not the subject of something older and more precise. You tell yourself it will stop if you ignore it or if you move. But these apparitions, if that is what they were, kept to a ritual. They liked 9 o'clock. They liked Christmas Eve. The neighbors, when I asked in a roundabout way, "Have you heard Carolyn late?" shrugged and told me stories. Tales of a trio of faces seen in 1984, of a disappearance that had the whole block whispering for years. People say disappearance like it is a weather event, something that passes over neighborhoods and leaves a little chill. I did what any rational person would do. I tried to find records. I asked at the library. I dug through online clippings that scrape the past like a comb. I asked the woman at the corner store if anyone remembered a trio of carolers named Margaret, David, and Sarah. She frowned, then lowered her voice. There were rumors, she said. 3 kids, or rather 3 young adults, used to stand on porches here every winter. They sang like children, but they looked older than that. One morning in '84, some people said they left and never came back. The town held a search. The ground got turned up, and then nothing. People like to forget things like that. That is the protective mechanism of a town. It buries its oddness in the soft dirt of memory and moves on. It is also the kind of evasive language that made my skin prickle. The parcel of rumor and the facts that feed rumor are different beasts. Rumor can be kind. Rumor can shield you from looking too closely. But people also remember in the parts that rumor forgets. Midnight vigils, whispered names, rituals that return each year like a tide. The 3rd night they did not come at 9. They came at 8:50, early enough to catch me in the act of making dinner.
Their song slipped through the cracks in the window like smoke. I opened the door to ask them to stop, because it felt, the correct word would be polite, though what I meant was self-protective. They sang for me instead, and then they sang about the place inside my house where I kept my grandmother's letters, letters no one outside my family would have reason to know about. When I told the local police that there were people appearing who did not show up on camera and spoke of the private things in my house, the officer listened and made a face that suggested both interest and exasperation. He checked the footage himself and came away with a shrug and the suggestion that perhaps the camera lens had been dirtied or an angle missed. He offered to do a more thorough sweep. He offered, in that minimal way police do, that they would keep an eye on the block. He offered the small comfort of presence. The nights kept the ritual. The song always began ordinary and then slid like a plate from a table into something that belonged only to whoever it addressed. The lyrics turned personal. An old scar behind the left knee, a nickname never spoken in public, the tree my neighbor had set aflame one December by mistake. Each private detail was the kind that could only have been learned by someone who had been there, or by someone who had read the dust of the house like a map. I set up more cameras. I replaced the battery and the porch light. I bought a more expensive motion sensor. In every setting, the cameras recorded nothing at the times the three figures appeared in person. They never left footprints in the snow. They never trailed cigarette smoke that might be analyzed. They simply arrived and left like specters with the manners of old-fashioned guests. Sometimes they left a single object on the stoop, a pressed flower, a child's button, a scrap of music paper with a phrase from the songs written across it. The objects were always items that later turned out to match descriptions in an old missing persons summary. A button from a jacket the missing woman was reported wearing on the night she vanished. A fragment of a sheet that matched a photo from a family's album. I told myself the objects might be vintage finds from a second-hand shop. I pretended this to other people and to myself with increasing vigor. At night I would lie awake and imagine their faces up close, imagining features that the porch light could not reveal. My imagination is not kind. It makes deliberate decisions to show you what might be the worst possible configuration of events. One afternoon, I found an old clipping in the library archive, a tiny column from 1984, a brief report about 3 local carolers who were last seen on December 24th, and a subsequent inquiry concluded nothing definitive. There was a name at the bottom of a scanned letter to the editor, Richard Lowe, who had written about the sadness of losing innocent voices to whatever fate had claimed them. The name meant nothing and everything, as names do.
It tethered rumor to a person, which is somehow both more believable and more terrifying. The neighbors, most of them older now, kept their own counsel. There was a woman, Mrs. Hall, who lived 2 houses down and had been a child in 1984. She would not say much, but when she did, her voice tightened. They came at night, even then, she said, not like kids. Not like people, just present. She clasped a knitting needle in both hands as if it did anchor her in time. We stopped opening the door some years after that. It became a rule. If you don't know them, don't let them in. I know that seems small when you're young, doesn't it? We were all foolish then. Yet rules are porous things. People slip them without meaning to. Houses that are empty invite things in. They give ambitions places to rest. The house I stayed in that weekend had been sold and rented out 3 times in the last decade. Each tenant left with the strange manner of someone who has been told a private story and finds it impossible to speak about. On the 5th night, something else happened. I was in the kitchen when the song came. It slipped under my window like a hand. Their melody, instead of turning to me, turned into a prayer.
One of the voices, low and thin, hummed a line about a concrete slab where the ground keeps secrets. All the windows in the house vibrated with the sound, and for a second the light overhead flickered as if acknowledging the line. My skin felt like paper. I pressed my palms flat to the counter as if I could anchor myself to something solid. I went out to the porch with the camera in hand because the rational part of me still believed that some footage somewhere would reconcile what I saw with what the screen showed. I filmed for an hour. The porch remained empty on the footage. On the fourth night, my neighbor's Labrador, a stupidly brave animal who loved all people, threw itself at the door and began to whine. It was quiet in the way only dogs can be, sensing something and being terrorized by the absence of it. Later, the owners found a footprint in the soil near the old oak, 3 small depressions, each the size of a child's palm and arranged like a symbol. The mud had dried there in a pattern. People told me to leave. Friends insisted I take a trip, to go anywhere but where the song had become a calendar. I told myself I would be brave. I told myself I would watch and see where the story led. That was when the lyric changed in a way that made my throat close. Margaret, the woman with the bell voice sang, and the porchlight hummed as if answering. David, the bass harmonized. Sarah, the high counterpoint finished. They sang the names as if naming a prayer. I felt suddenly as if the song were not about me at all, but about them, something summoned, not summoned by me. The song drifted then into a line about foundations that remember, and a line about 2 shovels and 1 regret. I ran to the archive the next morning.
The old clipping, the small column mentioning the trio, was joined now by another handwritten note someone had slipped into the microfilm drawer. Check the foundation at 12 Pine. The handwriting was not mine. It was not any of the neighbors when I compared it to bills and grocery lists. It was cramped and urgent. Someone had been trying to say something for years. I left the house that day with a small pack of paper copies and the sensation that the world had tilted for me. The story of a neighborhood is a collection of small things, ornaments, letters, jokes, and it can be reconstrued into something larger if you pull at the threads. The carolers were a cluster of threads, tied to a name, a date, a sloping lawn. The threads pulled, and the shape of something that had been suppressed began to show. I was not prepared for what came next. The small, polite details I had been collecting like proof began to connect in a way that suggested a center. At the center was a place where a child might have been buried and a secret kept under concrete and mortar. At the center was a denial that had hardened into a ritual of apparition. But that, I realized as I sat in the archive and watched the fall light make patterns on my notes, was a terrible thing to say out loud, because once you suggest a specific horror, you become the kind of person who must sit with it. I drove back to the house with a spade in the trunk and a ridiculous thought that I might be the one to unearth the past. It was a thought rooted in the foolishness of wanting control. People who say they seek truth often mean that they want to hold a neat, clean version of it in their hands. The truth about places like this is never neat. It is always messy and smells faintly of damp earth and the things people say once before they forget. When I stopped at the house and looked at the yard, green and tidy with a tree that had once burned in December, I could see the curve of the concrete slab where the old foundation had been fixed. There were cracks like veins across it. The neighbors, when asked by me in my direct, pushy way, looked away. They said things like, "We had a fight here once," and "people claimed things, but nobody proved anything." They were protective in the way people who have carried a secret for years become. They had a right to that protection. They also had a right to the truth. I dug a shallow hole at the edge of the slab, more for the ceremony than the practicality. When you take a spade to the earth in a neighborhood full of old grudges, you expect the police to show up. You expect the neighbors to watch. You do not expect what I found. A small, corroded tin box that swam up like a memory. Inside it was nothing bright, no jewelry, no papers of value, only a brittle napkin and a scrap of music paper with a child's scribble.
The napkin had a name faintly visible through coffee stains. The letters were incomplete, but enough to read, Sarah.
I could have stopped there and left the rest to the authorities. I did not. I brought the scrap of music paper home and pinned it to a board and stared at it until my eyes blurred. The melody written on it matched the line the carolers always sang. It was, in that small, appalling way, a map back to the thing that made people stop answering their doors. It is easy to say you did something brave. It is harder to live inside the consequences. The neighbors began to avoid me after that day, as if my digging had torn a membrane they had been using to keep the past soft and manageable. The police called it evidence handed over for inquiry and took the scrap of music and the tin box and the story I told them. They asked me to file a statement. They promised to look into the archive of '84. They asked if I wanted to speak with the detective. I agreed, because you agree to things when you cannot think of anything else to do. You learn quickly that institutions are both helpful and limited. An investigator can do a lot with a scrap of paper and a witness who is willing to be persistent. But there are types of memory that do not respond to questions. There are rituals that do not break because someone takes a statement. The carolers kept coming at 9, or sometimes at 8:50. They kept their ritual like someone keeping time in a house where all clocks have been removed. That is where I am going to leave this for now. The porch lit in that soft, late holiday glow, the camera showing nothing while 3 people stand where none exist, and the music paper pinned to a board in my apartment like a small, stubborn flag. The story there is not over. There is, in fact, a darker turn, a revelation about the foundation, a connection to someone who once lived and to a name that keeps reappearing. But the revelation is not mine to broadcast casually. It needs to be handled like a thing fragile and dangerous. For now, the ritual repeats at 9. The neighborhood keeps its lights up a little longer. The carolers keep singing a song that names the dead by their childhood names. And the thing that began with a name in a jar, my jar, the one from a department store charity, has broadened into an idea that when the season encourages us to open doors, it also opens histories. It invites not only present strangers but time itself to step across thresholds. When a tradition is a habit of opening, it becomes a pathway. The 3 of us, 3 accounts, 3 grooves carved into winter, begin to tremble at the same frequency. A kindness misread becomes obsession. A song becomes a summons. A house keeps a resident hidden behind the plaster. The holiday season is full of openings. The stories I am telling you are about what might come through them. Listen to your doorbell differently this year. Take care when you answer. But know that sometimes the things that find you are not looking for anything you have left outside. They are looking for the small, tender places inside your life that rituals always touch. The carolers are still singing. The clock on my phone reads 8:58. The porch light hums with a tired, patient electricity. I can hear a faint note, the beginning of a harmony. I step toward the window because the next line is about to land, and the line is not mine to finish yet. The porch light hummed, and then, very faintly, a note threaded itself through the air. Just a single, clean bell tone that could have been part of the carol or the house settling. I couldn't be sure which. It grazed the glass like a fingernail and then resolved into a chord. The music rose, and the 3 voices named the 3 names they always did. I watched the reflection of myself in the pane, and in that reflection, the faces in the glare blurred into a memory that wasn't mine alone. I called the detective I had met when I handed over the scrap of music. He agreed to come by in the morning, but cautioned me not to touch anything, not because I could ruin evidence, but because people who meddle with the past often end up carrying it in a way they hadn't planned. That sounded like wisdom. It also sounded like something you say to a person you've already moved to the edge of deciding whether their courage is bravery or obsession. I did not know which wing of that house I belonged to. The excavation was one of those slow, careful things that makes you watch the earth as if you expect it to move like a breathing patient. They tore up a strip of the concrete with machines that fussed and coughed and left the yard looking like a wound. The press came and left like flies, more interested in the sentence "possible discovery" than in the tenderness of what was being handled. Neighbors crowded at the edges of their porches, eyes bright and tired. When the police pried free a slab, they found a hollow underneath, exactly where the song and the scrap had suggested. They brought up what they described with a sort of close-mouthed accuracy. Fragments of cloth, a child's shoe sole with the kind of wear that comes from hopscotch or skipping, and then bones. They used the word remains and skeletal and kept their voices careful in front of me, because the kindness of language is to make the terrible sedenter than it is. The authorities took samples, left tags, called people in to document it. The bones were not sensationalized by the press in my presence. They were catalogued and shuttled away. The detective who had come to the house later told me the remains were consistent with the descriptions in the old missing persons filings from 1984. 3 sets, he said, in a way that made the word 3 feel like a weight. Records pulled from the county showed a paper trail that was tender and jagged in equal measure. The house was owned in the early 80s by a man named Richard Lowe.
There were mentions of complaints, a small string of notes that marked him as an unpleasant neighbor, and, more chillingly, a record of his leaving town and the house changing hands multiple times after 1984. There were photographs of him in a grainy news clipping and streets of rumor that had bitten into people's memories. He was a person who appeared where a story needed an antagonist. He was also a man who, if you traced property deeds and late-night complaints, lined up with where the hurt happened. He died in another state years later, the record showed. Whether he had been directly responsible, the detective and the report were careful not to say, was something the evidence was meant to clarify. I was not an expert, and I did not want to be the only instrument of judgment in a matter so brittle. The neighborhood reacted in the peculiar human way it does when something true that had been held like a rumor is finally given form. Some people wanted justice, some wanted to close the hole and go on pretending nothing had been under the concrete at all. Mrs. Hall, who had been a child there in 1984, came by the day they removed the slab. She stood at the edge of the yard with a knitting bag at her feet and watched calmly while the technicians worked. After they finished, she touched my hand and spoke in that low voice of people who have held grief for decades. "We tried to tell them," she said. "Something kept us from seeing it. We weren't meant to know. But you found it, and now it won't leave the rest of us the same." The police reopened the old files and called in specialists to try to identify the remains. They interviewed old neighbors, tracked down names cloaked in yellowed newspapers, and compared scraps of memories with the scraps of cloth that had been pulled from the ground. They found small things, jewelry the families recognized, pieces of a dress described in an old photograph, a button that matched one in a school portrait. The family members of Margaret, David, and Sarah came forward, some relieved in a way that grief never quite lets speak the words, others furious at the lateness of discovery. There were interviews with officials who admitted the 1984 inquiry had been hampered by limited resources and a town that preferred not to dig into itself too hard. That is the kind of institutional failure that translates into long winters of silence. We held a small private memorial on a gray morning. 3 little bouquets tied to a porch rail. People brought candles and stories. The song, the one the carolers always sung, echoed in my head like an indecipherable manuscript. The detective told me quietly that the evidence suggested the 3 had not simply disappeared by chance, that there was a human plan at the center of it, and that plan had probably involved the house on that street and everyone who had kept their eyes away from it.
He did not say the word murder when he spoke to me privately. He used softer language that hinted at violence and wrongdoing.
The press used harder words and got them wrong sometimes. I preferred the detective's measured approach because the soft phrases still carried the weight of what had been done. After the official watch and the forensic lights and the chains of tape, the real insistence returned. At 9 o'clock on winter nights, the three of them kept arriving. You would think that uncovering the truth would settle things, that it would pull the ghost right off whatever hook the town had mounted it on. It did not. Their ritual persisted, as if the uncovering only made their habit sturdier. The song still wove itself into the air on the night the streetlight hums. The same line about foundations and shovels kept inches from my ear in the weather of my apartment. I sold the house less than a year later, more out of a sense of being chased by a history than by any legal counsel. Buyers came and left like migratory birds, and at closing I felt a kind of lightness that was almost absurd, like shedding a coat that smelled of smoke. The person who bought it later kept the porch light on long after December. Their daughter swore she sometimes heard a choir by their window when the rest of the block was quiet. I moved to a place where the mail came through a slot and packages were delivered with the clinical precision of Amazon's vans. I told myself the city had changed. I told myself that the three names were tucked now inside envelopes, and that would be the end of it. Still, every Christmas Eve at 9, I listen. When a car passes on the street, I check the time. If someone walks past the window, I look for Victorian coats and faces that have the wrong kind of age. The ritual is not the same thing as guilt. It is merely the echo of being given back a piece of truth and being charged with remembering it. People ask if the singing was paranormal or psychiatric, if it was a group of enthusiasts with a taste for the macabre, if it was something the town collectively imagined. I say what I know. I saw them. I filmed them. The cameras sometimes did not. The music sometimes came when there was nothing to see. The bones were real. The names were real. The rest sits in the space between explanation and the county's capacity to settle a question entirely. And then there is the small, stubborn thing you never quite get rid of. An object left on a doorstep, a scrap of paper pinned in a drawer, a hymn line stuck in the throat like a fishbone. I have a photograph in a box of the thin, creased scrap that started the whole thing. It is folded into an envelope, and I keep it because the mind needs anchors, and because sometimes anchors are all you have against the weather. They keep singing. They will probably sing as long as someone in that place remembers how to listen.
A few months after the excavation, I met someone. The next story is not mine to claim, but I carry it the way a host carries a song. Her name was Anna when she asked me to include her account. She and her husband had bought a Victorian that had been priced suspiciously low and sold to them with phrases like "great bones" and "needs a little TLC." They were, in the way many newlyweds are, brimful of plans, paint colors mapped out, a Christmas tree imagined in the bay window, ornaments they had collected from thrift shops making their first polite arrangements. It began small. They called me because the things in their home were rearranging while they were awake. An ornament, a red glass ball the size of a plum, would be shifted from the upper branch of the tree to hang so low it almost brushed the floor. A stocking would be pulled down and folded like a letter. Their keys went missing for hours and reappeared under a cushion that had been on a different chair 5 minutes before. At first they blamed the cat. Their cat was fat and obliging and not to be trusted with luggage. But the cat had a preference for a particular windowsill and did not, as a rule, learn how to tuck notes between pages. There were footsteps at night, thin, stuttering sounds that seemed to live between 1 and 3 in the morning. Light in the attic flared briefly, like someone testing a lamp and then turning it off. The couple set up cameras in the living room, kitchen, and in the hallway that led to the attic hatch.
The footage, they said, showed ordinary nights of a house at rest, the refrigerator humming, the cat nosing at curtains, snow melting off a furled mat. They did not get the man who, they would later claim, had been living in the structure above their heads. One morning, the adamantine kind of morning, when sunlight makes a thing warmer than it is, Anna pried open the attic hatch and found a ladder that had been lowered and then shoved back up. The ladder itself was an old, creaky thing, its rungs dark with age and smudged with footprints. It gave the impression of having been used recently. There was a smell that I have tried to describe 100 times, half old laundry and half the scent of a room that has been closed for years, a smallness of air like the inside of a pocket. The couple found a sleeping bag folded with care at the edge of the rafters, an empty tin of soup, a toothbrush, and a small carved figurine that had been wedged between beams. They called the police. Officers came and did what the police do. They made a search of accessible spaces. They checked the house thoroughly. They asked if the owners had tinkered with the attic in recent weeks. The initial sweep found no one. The officers told them someone could have been using crawl spaces between the walls or a void behind the chimney. They promised to keep an eye on the property.
That seemed like an odd comfort, to have the institution's official gaze settle on you in the way a blanket is placed over a small animal. After the first search, more things happened. A photograph appeared on their kitchen table that neither of them owned, a picture of the couple asleep on the sofa, dated 3 nights before. The edges were yellowed like an old Polaroid, and the picture had that unrepeatable softness that film gives. The angle suggested it had been taken through a crack in a door. On the back of the photograph, in pen that skittered, was a single word: home. They began to feel watched, not by a camera, but by the architecture itself. Drawers that had been organized would be messy in the morning. Pantry items went missing in measured amounts, a box of cereal half full, milk poured from the top. The couple found a small, crude map tucked into the hollow of a skirting board, a sketch of their house with shaded corridors in the walls, little arrows and notes like vent to attic and underfloor crawl. It was written in a hurried hand and dotted with dates that suggested that whoever had made it had spent years learning the house better than anyone else. They set more cameras, hidden ones in vents, a camera pointing at the attic ladder, one in the back room where the old coal chute sat. On the night footage was most intricately checked, the cameras showed nothing but the house breathing. The attic camera, however, had a frame in which the ladder hung open and a shadow moved past so faintly the technician had to slow the file to see it. Slow it further, and you could make out a shape, no more than a suggestion of shoulders. When the couple played the clip with the sound turned up, there was a small, unmistakable noise, the creak of a boot on a rung, and then, urgently, the sound of someone whispering. The whisper was too muffled to understand clearly, but it had a cadence that suggested names, lists, a routine. The couple confronted the house the way people try to confront an awkward truth. They changed locks, set alarms, moved the tree away from the bay window, and taped the ornaments into place. They slept with headphones on and monitored the sound with an app that made creaks into a chart. They halved the house into sections and took turns staying awake in each one. The intrusions continued with a patience that made me think of hunting. Small tests, then retreats. Food missing, a shoe moved, a scrap of paper with a journal entry about the right wall tucked beneath a couch. Once, in the morning, Anna found a row of photographs pinned to the underside of the mantel, pictures of the two of them when the house had been empty, images showing them in the rooms they'd yet to inhabit. Each photo dated the day the house had been listed for sale. The journals the couple found in a hidden nest between the rafters were what cut the most.
The handwriting there was careful and sane, and the entries were quotidian in a way that was chilling. He will not notice. He never notices the odd gaps. December 4th. moved to the back vent, found a clean place to sleep. The house knows where the seams are and leads me to them. The handwriting belonged, the couple thought, to the person who had been living in the house with a patience that had made him invisible. One page listed names that meant nothing to the couple at first. Later, after the name David Carver surfaced from a background check and neighborhood gossip, and after they found a scrap of a municipal form with that name scrawled in the margin, the couple put pieces together. The journals had been a map and a record. The map led to places doors forgot, and the record told of someone else's slow disappearance into a house. The first time he spoke to them in the open, it was not like an invasion in a movie. He did not burst through the door or brandish anything. He lowered the attic ladder in the small hours, climbed down by voice, and stood at the top of the stairs, his face in shadow. He had the calm of someone who has been rehearsing the line he'd use. "This is my house," he said. The voice was flat. The sentence had the casual entitlement of someone who believes the world owes them arrangement. When they told the police he had spoken, the officers came and searched with flashlights and dogs. They found the outer nest, blankets, a stack of newspapers, a toothbrush, but they did not find a person. The dogs traced a scent and then lost it. They could not find where the scent led beyond the closed walls. One officer later told the couple that this sort of squatting is often the work of people who survive by being small, and that sometimes they find a structure with seams and make it work for them. He did not use the vocabulary of malice. He used language that suggested social problems. But the journals contained things that made the situation feel less like a social problem and more like premeditation. There were lists of names with annotations, dates circled, addresses highlighted. There were comments that suggested someone had watched the couple for months. They hang the wreath at night. They come home at 7:15 most nights. There were drawings of vents and arrows and what appeared to be a timetable. They found one entry that made their skin tighten. "If they wake, be calm. Explain that I am only keeping the house until they see it as I do." That phrasing suggested the person living inside had an ideology about ownership. This was his habitat, and anyone else was an intruder. When the couple tried to take the matter to court, they ran into a tangle that is depressingly familiar. If you don't have direct evidence of entry or the person in hand, it's difficult to press serious charges. The police could arrest for trespass if they found him in the act, but they did not. The legal system is good at cataloging proof you already have, less adept at protecting you preemptively. There were suggestions of installing steel plates, of leaving lights on in the attic, of setting a humane trap by leaving a camera and bait. The couple did these things. One night, a motion-activated camera in the attic recorded a man moving like a shadow behind the insulation. The pixelated image was enough for a warrant, the detective said, but when they executed it, the man was gone. They found a hollow the size of an adult between two studs, an act of drywall and patience, and a shoebox of Polaroids showing faces in the house before the couple moved in, dated years apart. The footage and the hollow and the photographs gave them a name the police could pursue: David Carver. The name connected to a string of small local trespassing reports in neighboring towns, an arrest recorded in a county docket years earlier for unlawful presence, and then a record which maddeningly stopped like a song cut off mid-verse. They could not locate a current address. They could not find a phone number. The last known report suggested he had been seen leaving the area on foot in the winter of a certain year. The couple was told some people travel like this. They slip across the seams of houses, and no one quite tracks the path. The stuff of fantasy and the stuff of reality overlapped until the difference was indistinguishable. The day the couple finally confronted him in a way that felt final, they had stepped into the living room to find the tree rearranged. Ornaments had been strung to form letters along a branch, crude and earnest. They read in a childish, looping script fashioned by glass and thread, "Home, home, home." They felt anger then, righteous, practical anger that wants to throw things and name names. They set him a meeting they could control and laid a plan with the police. Cameras, a call to the local station, a team waiting in the yard. When the ladder creaked that night and a shadow dropped into the house, the officers moved in. What they found was a figure who had a way of speaking that was both calm and frighteningly intimate. He did not lash out. He spoke in a tone that suggested years of rehearsed patience about the house as if it had been his all along. "It remembered me," he said. "The house kept me. I sleep where it's warm, and I keep watch where it's cold. People throw things and take them back. It's never the same." He did not plead for sympathy. He narrated his life like a fact. They dragged him out into the light. In the harsh fluorescent bulb of the police wagon, he looked neither monstrous nor particularly impressive, just a worn man with ink on his hands. The journalists called him a squatter. The couple called him a thief. The defense lawyer called him a man who had nowhere to go. The report said he was charged with trespass and petty theft. The journal entries found in the crawl spaces were entered into evidence.
But then there was the small, terrible last line many officials prefer to avoid. After being processed, after being held overnight, after a nominal hearing, David Carver was released because he was a person without a fixed address and the arrest did not meet the elements needed for a longer detention. The prosecutor, balancing resources and paperwork, passed on escalating the case. The legal apparatus, slow, bureaucratic, human, did not always have the appetite to force a resolution. People made phone calls. The case languished. That night, as they walked back into their living room, the couple found that someone had left 3 small Polaroids fanned across the mantel. They showed the 2 of them together in a moment of private laughter, photographed through a space in the wall at a date 3 weeks earlier. On the back of one, scrawled in the same hand as the attic journals, was this: "Keep the lights on for me. I like to see who comes home." The message was not a threat in a cinematic sense. It was a quiet, steady ownership that felt worse. After the release, he was gone. They never saw him again in person. They later found out that a man named David Carver had served time in various minimal sentences in neighboring counties and had been reported as living transiently for years. Whether he had been living in other homes in the way he had lived in theirs, behind walls, beneath floors, was something the police speculated on and then put in a file. The couple moved within 6 months. They left the tree with its ornaments to a neighbor and sold the house at a loss. They told me, in the safe way you tell someone who will not make your fear look irrational, that the moving did not change anything inside their heads. They hear creaks in motel rooms. They check closet doors 3 times when they travel. They will never leave a throw blanket across a chair without checking the underside. I think of their story when I hang a wreath or pass a thrift store window with ornaments looped in bulbs. Their fear is a domestic thing, not sensational, not cinematic, the small, grinding erosion of what it means to be safe in your home. The holidays offer us 1,000 tiny invitations to make our houses into open places. We welcome people in because we assume the world will reciprocate in pleasant rhythms. Sometimes that goodwill is exploited by someone who has learned to be patient. After hearing Anna and her husband's account, I understood what the red scarf at my door and the carolers on the porch had in common with the man in the walls. They all took advantage of openings that holiday rituals create. Secret Santas, porch carols, open doors, these things are infrastructures of trust. They are also, because people are capable of both tenderness and cruelty, paths into someone's private geography.
The 3 stories, the jar's name that became obsession, the Victorian carolers whose song named the buried, and the hidden resident who claimed a house without ever paying for it, are different sorts of trespass. One is a theft of identity, an insistence on replacing you with a person who had been erased. One is the repetition of a violence that time did not close, but instead turned into ritual. One is an occupant who made a home of the gaps in a city's houses. Each uses the season's assumed generosity as a vector. If there is a lesson here, it is not an instruction manual. I will not tell you to stop leaving your porch light on, or to ban carolers, or to make every charity organizer produce a notarized affidavit. That would be missing the point. The right word is awareness, a soft, bracing attention that does not turn every act of kindness into suspicion, but does ask for a moment's thought. After the stories, people ask me what I do now when December comes, how I celebrate, whether I bought a tree, whether I still leave a plate of cookies out with a whisper that says, "For Santa." The answer is complicated. I keep small rituals, but I guard others. I like to think there is a way to hold both wonder and vigilance at once. That is a luxury, I know, and not everyone is equipped for it without guilting their neighbors. I am not saying people should close themselves utterly. I am saying there are small practices you can adopt that do not require you to become paranoid. Verify, be mindful of what you share, and when a kindness feels like it is leaning too heavily into your personal space, you are allowed to set a boundary. But boundaries are for the living things in our lives, not for the ghosts or for the small, unpleasant men who hide in attic voids. They are for our friends and our families and for ourselves. What the three tales have taught me, and what I hope in telling them will teach you, is that the rituals that make the season kind also make it porous. A jar for names, a porch for song, a house open for decorating, they are small invitations. Most of the time, the people who answer them return the favor. Sometimes they do not. If you are thinking of the practical, the locks, the cameras, the vetted charity lists, there is room for those things. If you are thinking of the human, the way a neighbor's warm cup of tea can change your night, that room should remain too. I only ask this: listen carefully and do not dismiss what your instincts tell you. When the music turns personal, when a gift seems meant to map your life, when a pattern appears and it unsettles you, take it seriously. As for me, I still keep a scarf in a drawer I don't open in December. I keep the folded scrap of music in another box. On the nights when the wind is thin and the porch light hums, I will listen at 9, because that is what remembering asks of you.
I do not want to be cold-hearted. I merely have learned that a small, deliberate care keeps other small and terrible surprises from settling. These are alleged true accounts. People I met in the waking hours between dinner and sleep told them to me. I cannot certify every shade of the experiences any more than I can prove weather by saying it rained in my dreams. What I can say is this: the holidays lower a kind of guard, and lowering that guard sometimes makes room for things you cannot easily put back. So, if, when you hang your next ornament or answer a knock this season, you feel a small chill, treat it kindly. Check the name on that charity jar more than once. Listen to your porch beyond the surface of the music. A kindness is still a kindness, but not all kindnesses are entirely benign. If you want more real quiet nightmares and the stories behind them, subscribe. If you don't, at least keep the porch light within reach this year. I close the box where I keep the scrap of music and step back into the present. The house is quieter now, the city a distant bright wash of motion. Somewhere, on a street that has learned to keep its lights a little longer, microphones pick up a faint harmony at 9, and a porch remains empty on the camera. The red scarf at the stoop has been folded into a box in some forgotten hall. The attic is closed, and the ladder up there is, for the time being, still. The season is an invitation, and invitations can be accepted or refused. They can also be used as maps. I have learned to carry both a string of lights and a